Inside a plain crack in the cliffs above the Dead Sea sits a cave that beat every scroll discovery before it to the ground and lost everything inside it to looters, decades before archaeology ever arrived. The official story says one isolated desert sect hid the Dead Sea Scrolls here, sealed away and untouched until 1947. That story is wrong. The black market that raided these cliffs decades before any archaeologist arrived made sure no one could ever prove the old version again. Dr. Oren Gutfeld had spent years hunting for one cave the looters never found, the last untouched entry point into a 2,000-year-old secret. In February 2017, in the cliffs west of Qumran, he finally broke through into one. What was waiting inside would turn out to be far stranger and far more damaging to the official story than a single missing scroll. The cave sat in the cliffs of the Judean desert, a short walk from the ruins of Qumran, and for the first time in over half a century, archaeologists had located a genuine, previously unrecorded Dead Sea Scroll cave. Dr. Oren Gutfeld and Ahayed Ovadia from Hebrew University had been working the site with a team from Liberty University led by Dr. Randall Price, who had first spotted the cave's entrance back in 2010 and spent years trying to get an excavation approved. When they finally broke through into the chamber, they found exactly the kind of material that had made previous scroll caves famous. Storage jars, the kind used 2,000 years ago to protect scrolls from moisture and light. A rolled piece of parchment, prepared for writing but never used. A leather strap meant to bind a completed scroll shut. Wrapping cloth, still folded, waiting for something that was never placed inside it. For a moment, it looked like the discovery of a lifetime. The Dead Sea Scrolls are not just old documents. They are the oldest surviving copies of large portions of the Hebrew Bible, predating other known manuscripts by roughly 1,000 years. They reshaped how scholars understood the origins of Judaism and early Christianity, and they turned a set of desert caves into one of the most studied archaeological sites on the planet. Fragments of Isaiah, Genesis, Psalms, and dozens of other texts sit today inside the Shrine of the Book at the Israel Museum, under climate-controlled glass, visited by millions of people who come to stand near something that predates the fall of Jerusalem, the birth of Christianity, and most of what we call ancient history. More than 25,000 fragments have been recovered from 11 confirmed caves, pieced together over decades into roughly 900 separate manuscripts, a scale of discovery that dwarfs almost anything else ever pulled out of the ancient world. So, when word spread that a 12th scroll cave had been found, some scholars proposed calling it Cave 12. It felt like the beginning of something enormous. And then the team reached the back wall of the cave, and the mood changed. Pickaxe heads, buried in the dirt, left behind by looters who had broken into this exact cave decades earlier, sometime in the mid-20th century, and taken whatever scrolls had been sitting inside. Gutfeld put it plainly to reporters. This was the closest anyone had come to a new Dead Sea Scroll discovery in 60 years, and it was already empty. Someone had gotten there first, and gotten there in silence, leaving nothing behind but the tools of the theft itself. That single detail should unsettle anyone who thinks the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls is closed. Because here is the uncomfortable math. Every scroll in the current collection that reached scholars through the antiquities market, rather than a controlled excavation, has a provenance built on second-hand accounts from Bedouin dealers who were, by their own admission, digging in the dark, selling to whoever paid first. Gutfeld himself said something striking after this find. He said we can no longer be certain that the locations attributed to the scrolls that reached the market through the Bedouins are accurate at all. If this cave could be robbed without anyone noticing, quietly, completely, and go undetected for half a century, what does that say about the 11 caves before it? What does it say about the scrolls we already have, sitting in museum cases with clean, confident labels claiming exactly where each one came from. This is not a story about one empty cave. This is about whether the official version of who hid the Dead Sea Scrolls, a version repeated in textbooks and museum placards for 70 years, can survive contact with the evidence that keeps surfacing. And in the years since, 3 separate lines of research, a genetic study, an artificial intelligence model, and a forensic art investigation have each taken their own turn at that version. None of them destroyed it outright. All of them made it harder to repeat with a straight face. Here's what most people believe. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Ed-Dib went looking for a lost goat near Qumran, threw a rock into a cave opening, heard something break, and climbed in to find the first scrolls, sealed inside clay jars that had sat undisturbed for nearly 2,000 years. Excavations followed through the 1950s, led by the French Dominican priest and archaeologist Roland de Vaux. He identified a nearby settlement, Khirbet Qumran, as the home of the people who wrote and hid the scrolls. He pointed to a long room with tables and inkwells and called it a scriptorium, a writing room. He pointed to multiple ritual immersion pools and called them evidence of a disciplined religious community obsessed with ceremonial purity. And he connected all of it to 3 ancient writers, Josephus, Philo of Alexandria, and Pliny the Elder, who each described a Jewish sect called the Essenes, austere, communal, celibate, and devoted to ritual purity. Only one of those 3 writers, Pliny, actually places the Essenes on the western shore of the Dead Sea. Josephus and Philo both describe them as scattered across many towns throughout Judea, not confined to a single settlement in the desert. The connection between Qumran and the Essenes has always leaned more heavily on Pliny's one geographic detail than most museum descriptions ever let on. The fit seemed clean. Some of the scrolls found in the caves, texts like the Community Rule and the Damascus Document, describe exactly the kind of strict, hierarchical, purity-obsessed community that Josephus and Philo attributed to the Essenes. For decades, this became the accepted story, printed in encyclopedias, and repeated on museum walls without much qualification. A small, isolated religious sect lived at Qumran, wrote and copied scripture in near total seclusion, and hid their library in nearby caves around 68 CE, right before Roman soldiers crushed the Jewish revolt and burned their way across Judea. Case closed. Sect identified. Motive established. Timeline confirmed. Except the fit was never quite as clean as it sounded, and the discomfort had been sitting there for decades before anyone gave it a name. Start with the graves. Cemeteries near Qumran contain the remains of women and children, buried alongside the men. That is a problem, because the Essenes, according to most ancient descriptions, practice celibacy. A community of celibate men does not typically produce family graveyards. Scholars have offered explanations: visiting relatives, a later burial period, a subgroup that permitted marriage, but none of them fully close the gap. It is the kind of detail that sits in the corner of a well-known story and never quite leaves, the sort of thing a museum label simply omits because there's no clean way to phrase it. Then there is the handwriting. Scholars have identified several hundred distinct scribal hands across the scroll collection, several hundred different people writing at different times in different styles on material that in some cases traveled from different places. Qumran, based on its size and the number of rooms uncovered by de Vaux's team, could not have housed a population anywhere near that large. So where did all those scribes come from? If they weren't all living at Qumran, who were they? And why did their work end up buried in these specific caves? Then there is the copper scroll, found in Cave 3, engraved on sheets of metal, rather than parchment because metal survives when parchment doesn't. It is unlike anything else in the collection. It isn't scripture, it isn't a communal rulebook. It is a list, cataloging enormous quantities of gold, silver, and other treasure, hidden at dozens of separate locations across the region. It reads like an inventory prepared by people managing wealth on an institutional scale, not a document produced by an ascetic desert sect that had, according to its own rules, renounced private property entirely. Each of these details, on its own, could be explained away. Together, they started to look like something else. And in 1980, a scholar named Norman Golb at the University of Chicago decided to say so publicly in academic papers that would follow him for the rest of his career. Golb's argument was not that the scrolls were fake or that Qumran didn't matter. His argument was that the accepted story had the wrong author. He proposed that the scrolls were never the exclusive product of one isolated sect at Qumran at all. Instead, he argued, they were the scattered remains of multiple libraries, most likely from Jerusalem itself, evacuated and hidden in the desert caves by refugees fleeing the Roman siege around 70 CE. In his reading, Qumran was not a monastery. It was a fortress, a military outpost, repurposed during the chaos of the revolt as a hiding place for whatever books and treasure people could carry out of a city about to burn. He pointed to exactly the details that never sat right. The women's graves, the scribal diversity, far too broad for one small settlement to have produced on its own. The copper scrolls treasure inventory, which fits a Jerusalem context far better than a desert commune with no property to speak of. He also noted that apart from the copper scroll, almost everything found in the caves consists of literary and religious texts, not the kind of everyday administrative documents you'd expect at the actual site where a community lived and worked day to day. Archaeologists Yitzhak Magin and Yuval Peleg later re-examined the Qumran ruins directly and proposed something closer to Golb's reading, a fortified way station, possibly connected to pottery production, rather than a monastic retreat built for prayer and copying scripture. Mainstream scholars pushed back hard, and they still do. Jody Magnus and others have defended versions of the Essene hypothesis for decades, pointing to the specific match between sectarian scroll language and ancient descriptions of a purity-focused Jewish sect that no other candidate explains quite as well. The debate never resolved. It just kept going, quietly, in academic journals, while museum labels around the world kept printing the simpler version for the public, the version with one sect, one settlement, and one clean motive. Science had already tried to settle this once before, decades before DNA or artificial intelligence entered the picture. In the early 1990s, laboratories in Zurich and Tucson ran radiocarbon tests on more than a dozen scrolls, hoping to end the argument for good. Mostly the results agreed with the handwriting-based dates scholars had already proposed. But not always. Some scrolls came back centuries older or younger than their paleography suggested, and researchers eventually traced part of the problem to the 1950s, when conservators had coated certain fragments in castor oil to make faded ink easier to read, contaminating the very carbon those later tests depended on. The dates were never as absolute as a lab result sounds. They were only as clean as the material scientists assumed they were testing, and assumptions like that don't always hold up under closer inspection. And then science did something ancient historians couldn't. It went inside the parchment itself. In 2020, a research team led by Oded Rechavi and Noam Mizrahi at Tel Aviv University, working with paleogeneticist Matthias Jakobson at Uppsala University and the Israel Antiquities Authority, published a study in the journal Cell that pulled ancient DNA out of the scrolls. Not the ink, not the writing, the skin the words were written on. Over roughly 7 years, they extracted usable genetic material from 26 fragments out of more than 25,000 pieces in the total collection, working only with unwritten sections to avoid damaging the text itself. They took micro-samples from blank margins and untouched edges, doing everything possible to avoid destroying a single letter of 2,000-year-old scripture, while still pulling enough genetic material to reconstruct a family tree of the animals whose skins had become scripture. Almost everything they tested was sheepskin, which made sense for a desert region where sheep were the practical local resource. But 2 fragments were not sheepskin. They were cowhide. and cattle need something the Judean desert simply does not have in reliable supply: grass, water, open pasture, the kind of land you find further north, in more fertile regions of ancient Judea, not on a dry cliff above the Dead Sea. Both cowhide fragments turned out to belong to two different copies of the book of Jeremiah, and the two copies contain textually divergent versions of the same book, different wording, different structure, written on material that most likely never came from anywhere near Qumran at all. If the parchment came from outside the desert, then whatever the isolated sect theory says about total seclusion starts looking too simple. Someone, somewhere, was bringing material and manuscripts in from elsewhere, and multiple versions of the same biblical book were circulating at the same time, copied by different hands, on skins from different regions. It got stranger. A fragment of the book of Isaiah, cataloged for decades as part of a group of related pieces, turned out to carry a genetic signature from its source sheep that didn't match the rest of that group at all. Same catalog number, same assumed origin, different animal, different flock, different likely point of origin. Scholars had been treating fragments as belonging together based on where they were physically found and how the handwriting looked. The DNA said some of those groupings, decades old and never seriously questioned, were simply wrong. And then there was Masada, roughly 30 miles south of Qumran. A copy of a religious hymn called the Songs of the Sabbath Sacrifice had also been found, matching sectarian material discovered in the Qumran caves. If both copies came from the same tight-knit, physically isolated community, you'd expect their source sheep to be closely related, animals from the same small flock, raised in the same limited territory. Instead, the Masada copy's genetic signature traced back to an entirely separate lineage. Two different communities, in two different locations, independently producing copies of the same sacred text, using animals from herds that had never mixed. Penina Shore, the Israel Antiquities Authority's scrolls curator, summarized the implication without softening it. The manuscripts, she said, do not all come from the desert where they were found. Richavi offered a comparison that made the stakes clear. Imagine, he said, that a country is destroyed and the only surviving library belongs to one small, extreme, isolated sect. What would future historians wrongly assume about that entire society based only on that single library? To be clear about what this study does and doesn't prove, it does not disprove that Essenes lived at Qumran, and it does not confirm Golb's theory outright. What it does is something quieter and, in some ways, more disruptive. It proves that the physical material behind these texts came from a wider, more scattered, more interconnected Judean world than the one isolated desert sect wrote everything version ever allowed for. The simple story survives. It just can't claim to be the whole story anymore. Then, in 2025, the scrolls faced a second kind of test, and this one didn't come from biology. It came from a machine. A team at the University of Groningen, led by Mladen Popovic, director of the university's Qumran Institute, built an artificial intelligence model they named Enoch. They trained it on 24 scroll fragments that had already been radiocarbon dated, teaching the model to recognize subtle patterns in handwriting, ink flow, and letter forms that correlate with a scribe's era, patterns too small for the human eye to reliably track. Then they turned Enoch loose on the undated majority of the collection, 135 additional manuscripts that scholars had only ever dated by eye, using traditional paleography. The results lined up with human expert judgment about 79% of the time. That's a strong match. It's the other 21% that matters. In several cases, Enoch pushed manuscripts older than paleographers had estimated, sometimes by decades. A fragment of the Book of Daniel, long dated to roughly a generation after the book's presumed author lived, was placed by the model closer to 70 years earlier, potentially landing within the lifetime of the very author scholars had assumed was already dead by the time this copy existed. Popovic put the implication directly This copy may have been made while the author or people who knew him were still alive. That reframes the timeline scholars have relied on for decades. Different Hasmonean and Herodian era handwriting styles, once assumed to follow a clean sequence, one replacing the other, appear to have coexisted earlier and longer than anyone accounted for. The scrolls aren't just older or younger than assumed in isolated cases. The entire framework for dating them by eye now has to be checked against a model that catches details human readers miss. Every date attached to every scroll in every textbook is at minimum a date worth checking again. None of this is the first time technology forced these texts to reveal something the naked eye had missed. Years earlier, the Israel Antiquities Authority partnered with Google on a digital imaging project, the Leon Levy Dead Sea Scrolls Digital Library, made public in 2012, scanning thousands of fragments under multiple wavelengths of light, visible and near infrared, and recovering text that had faded into total invisibility on the parchment surface. Letters no reader alive had been able to see for centuries. Every new imaging pass, every new dating model, every new genetic test keeps finding something the last generation of scholars simply couldn't detect. 2 proof moments in 5 years. A genetic result complicating where the scrolls came from. A machine learning result complicating when they were made. Neither one broke the story. Both made it heavier to carry. And then came the moment that had nothing to do with the ancient world at all, and everything to do with what happens when a mystery this famous meets a market hungry for more of it. In 2017, the Museum of the Bible opened in Washington, D.C., funded largely by Hobby Lobby President Steve Green, at a reported cost of roughly $500 million. Among its prized holdings were 16 fragments described as genuine pieces of the Dead Sea Scrolls, acquired between 2009 and 2014. Several bought directly from William Kando, son of the original Bethlehem antiquities dealer who had handled scroll sales since the earliest discoveries in the 1940s. These 16 fragments belong to a wave of so-called post-2002 pieces, dozens of previously unknown scroll fragments that surfaced on the private antiquities market after decades in which no new fragments had appeared at all. Collectors were thrilled, scholars were cautiously excited, some even publishing academic analysis treating the pieces as authentic additions to the known corpus. In 2016, a scholarly volume from the academic publisher Brill cataloged and discussed a number of these fragments as legitimate, folding them into the published record of the scrolls. That publication would later need to be quietly reconsidered. Here was fresh material from a discovery everyone assumed had been fully accounted for. In 2018, Germany's Federal Institute for Materials Research ran early tests on the collection and flagged 5 fragments as probable forgeries. The museum, to its credit, didn't bury the finding. It commissioned a full independent investigation led by Colette Lall, founder of Art Fraud Insights, funded by the museum itself, but with results guaranteed to be made public regardless of what they found. A team of conservators and scientists spent from February to October of 2019 examining all 16 fragments using microscopy, chemical analysis, and elemental mapping. Their report ran past 200 pages. The conclusion, announced in March 2020, was total. All 16 fragments were modern forgeries. The forensic details are the kind that make your skin crawl a little once you understand them. Most of the fragments weren't even the correct material. Genuine Dead Sea Scrolls are written on parchment. At least 15 of these 16 were leather, thicker, more fibrous, harder to date from a glance but chemically distinguishable under high magnification. One fragment had holes that matched the pattern of ancient Roman-era footwear, suggesting the forger may have used a literal old shoe as their canvas. The ink was the real giveaway. Under magnification, investigators found ink pooled inside cracks that shouldn't have existed when the writing was applied, and ink that trailed off torn edges as if it had run downhill into damage that was already there. That is not how ink behaves on fresh material. It's how ink behaves when someone paints letters onto a scrap of leather that is already old, already cracked, and already broken at the edges, and lets the ink follow gravity into flaws that predate the ancient text sitting on top of them. In other words, the forgers were writing scripture onto genuinely old scraps and calling it scripture. Chemist Jennifer Mass identified an amber-colored coating soaking every fragment, most likely animal skin glue, engineered to recreate the gummy sheen that real parchment develops naturally after 2,000 years of collagen breaking down. Researcher Aaron Sugar found calcium had penetrated deep into the material, consistent with a lime treatment used to strip hair from leather, a technique that likely postdates the era the fragments claimed to be from. The forgeries had even been dusted with clay minerals matching the actual sediment found around Qumran, a level of detail meant to survive casual inspection and pass for a genuine discovery under a curator's eye. Museum CEO Harry Hargrave called it what it was. We're victims of misrepresentation, we're victims of fraud. No one has definitively identified who produced these particular forgeries, though the shared coding across all 16 pieces points to a single source, someone with enough knowledge of ancient production methods to fool trained eyes for over a decade. What's clear is the motive. The market wanted new scrolls badly enough that someone built exactly what the market wanted, wrapped in enough convincing detail to fool serious collectors, respected academics, and eventually one of the best-funded $500 million museums on the planet. Here's what makes this scandal land harder than a simple story about fake antiquities. This didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened because the Dead Sea Scroll Discovery brand carries enormous weight, financial, religious, and academic, and that weight creates pressure to keep finding more of it, whether or not more genuinely exists. The forgeries weren't clumsy tourist trinkets. They were sophisticated enough to fool a federal institute's early screening for years, sophisticated enough to sit in a $500 million museum under expert supervision. If 16 fake fragments made it that far into one of the most scrutinized collections on Earth, the uncomfortable question is obvious. How many more are sitting quietly in private collections that have never been forensically tested at all? So look at where this leaves the official story. A cave found empty, robbed before science ever got there, exposing how little confidence anyone should have in the provenance of the caves that came before it. A genetic test proving some of the scrolls were never local to begin with, undercutting the image of one small, sealed community writing everything in isolation. An artificial intelligence model quietly rewriting the timeline scholars had trusted for generations, and a forensic investigation proving that the modern hunger for one more discovery is strong enough to manufacture exactly that, convincingly, for over a decade, inside one of the best-funded biblical museums in the world. None of this proves Golb was right and DeVoe was wrong. It proves something messier and more honest. The story was never as clean as the museum placards suggested, and every piece of new evidence, biological, computational, or forensic, keeps landing on the side of more complicated, never on the side of case closed. And the stakes here were never just academic. They never have been. The scrolls themselves remain the subject of an unresolved international dispute. From 1948 until the Six-Day War in 1967, the West Bank and East Jerusalem, including the sites where the scrolls were held, sat under Jordanian control. When Israel took the territory in 1967, it took custody of the majority of the collection, along with it eventually placing most of the scrolls in the Shrine of the Book at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, a building whose white domed roof was designed to echo the lid of the very clay jars that had protected the first scrolls, set across a plaza from a black basalt wall meant to evoke the sect's own imagery of light against darkness. Jordan never accepted that transfer as final, and neither, in later years, did Palestinian authorities, who claimed the scrolls as part of their own cultural inheritance. In 2009, when the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto hosted a major Dead Sea Scrolls exhibition, Jordan formally requested that Canadian authorities seized the scrolls under the terms of the 1954 Hague Convention, arguing Israel had removed cultural property from occupied territory illegally. The Palestinian Authority raised its own objection around the same time, calling the scrolls part of looted Palestinian cultural heritage and asking Canada's government to cancel the exhibit outright. Canada declined to intervene in either direction, stating that ownership was a matter for Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinian Authority to settle among themselves. Nobody has settled it. The scrolls keep traveling to international exhibitions, and the dispute keeps traveling with them, unresolved, waiting for the next museum tour to reopen it in front of a new audience. Layered underneath that political dispute sits the Kando family's long, complicated relationship with the scrolls, stretching back to the very first sales in the 1940s, when Khalil Iskander Shaheen, known as Kando, a Bethlehem cobbler and antiquities dealer, began buying fragments from Bedouin discoverers and reselling them to collectors and institutions abroad. That relationship continued for decades after his death in 1993, straight through to the post-2002 fragments that ended up forged inside the Museum of the Bible. Family members have said many of the post-2002 pieces sat for years in a Swiss bank vault before anyone thought to test them. One family's business connects the earliest whispers of the discovery to its most recent scandal, 70 years apart, and scholars are still debating how many of those later fragments, beyond the 16 already exposed, deserve the same scrutiny. And underneath all of that sits the Israel Antiquities Authority's ongoing survey of the Judean desert cliffs, an operation using drones, rappelling teams, and rock climbing equipment to search roughly 80 kilometers of terrain and hundreds of caves, hunting for anything looters might reach before archaeologists do. Officials say looting has almost stopped across the areas already searched, though roughly a quarter of that desert has never been searched at all, leaving plenty of room for whatever still remains hidden. In one operation tied to this same effort, teams working the Cave of Horror at Nahal Hever, named for the skeletons of refugees who died there during a later Jewish revolt against Rome, recovered around 80 new parchment fragments bearing Greek text from the Minor Prophets, the first controlled scroll discovery in 60 years, alongside a 6,000-year-old mummified child in a woven basket believed to be roughly 10,500 years old, among the oldest complete baskets ever found, not anywhere on Earth. The desert keeps producing evidence. Some of it real. Some of it, as we now know, manufactured to look that way. So who really hid the Dead Sea Scrolls? The honest answer, after DNA, after artificial intelligence, after a forensic investigation that exposed a museum full of fakes, is that we know less than the confident version of the story ever let on. Maybe an isolated sect at Qumran wrote and hid a portion of what we have. The evidence for that still stands, and mainstream scholarship still leans that way. But the physical material tells us other hands, other flocks, other communities contributed pages to the same collection, pages that traveled in from places the isolated sect story never accounted for. Maybe Golb was closer to right than mainstream scholarship wanted to admit. Maybe the truth sits somewhere between a desert monastery and a scattered network of Jerusalem refugees, each carrying what they could say before the Romans arrived at the gates. What we know for certain is this: the cave that started this investigation, the one found in 2017, is still sitting empty in those cliffs. The blank parchment inside it was never written on. The jars that once protected finished scrolls now protect nothing but dust, and the memory of a theft nobody witnessed and no one has ever been made to answer for. A quarter of the surrounding desert has never even been searched. Somewhere out there, sealed behind rock that no drone has mapped and no archaeologist has entered, there may be a cave that was never robbed at all, holding scrolls that could finally answer the question science keeps almost answering and never quite closing. Until then, the fragments we do have sit behind reinforced glass in Jerusalem, genetically scattered across a wider Judean world than the label on the case admits, dated by a machine that keeps finding them older than we thought, sharing museum shelves, once occupied by fakes, convincing enough to fool experts for over a decade. The official story is still printed on the wall beside the exhibit. It just doesn't fit everything sitting inside the case anymore. Visitors will keep filing past that glass in Jerusalem, reading a label written when the story still seems simple, never knowing that a short drive away, in a stretch of desert most of them will never see, the ground itself is still holding on to answers no one has been trusted to find yet. And somewhere in those cliffs above the Dead Sea, an empty cave is still waiting for someone to explain exactly what was taken from it and by whom.